Tonight, our journey begins at the quiet heart of Cardiff Castle, where Roman stone, Norman walls, and later centuries rest together within a single set of defences. We will stand inside layers of history built not all at once, but gradually, as each age left something behind and moved on. From there, we will travel slowly north into the wider landscape of South Wales, arriving at Caerphilly Castle, where stone walls rise from still water and marshland, and the ground itself was shaped to wait. Here, authority was expressed not through height alone, but through patience, repetition, and the steady presence of water. The fire is warm. The stone is ancient. There is nothing left for you to do now but listen. Adjust your pillows, pull the blankets close. Let the weight of the day begin to lift, like mist settling gently across the low ground, until even the edges of it soften and fade. Long before Cardiff was a city, long before it had streets, shops, or a name that sounded remotely Welsh, this patch of land beside the River Taff was already being watched. The Romans noticed it first. They tended to notice places like this, flat ground near a river, close enough to the sea to matter, high enough to see trouble coming. It was the kind of location that made Roman surveyors stop walking, look around quietly, and start measuring things. Around the middle of the 1st century, Roman forces arrived in what is now South Wales, as part of a long and exhausting campaign against the Silures. The Silures were not cooperative. They did not welcome Roman roads, Roman taxes, or Roman ideas about order. They resisted steadily, and often violently. So the Romans did what they usually did in such situations. They built forts. The earliest structures on the site of Cardiff Castle were timber forts, not elegant, not permanent, just practical. Wooden walls, earth banks, straight lines. 3 separate forts were built over time, each replacing the last as the Roman presence became more confident. These early forts were not meant to last forever. They were statements of intent. They told the surrounding countryside that Rome had arrived, and that it planned to stay long enough to make resistance inconvenient. The soldiers stationed here lived simple, repetitive lives. Guard duty, training, maintenance, watching the river, watching the land, waiting for orders. The fort existed less as a home and more as a tool. By the 3rd century, the nature of the threat had changed. Wales was largely under Roman control, but the wider world was becoming unstable. Raids from the sea increased. Roman Britain began to feel exposed. Around the year 270, the Romans replaced wood with stone. This was not a small upgrade. The new shore fort was a serious piece of engineering. Thick masonry walls, roughly 10 feet wide, were raised around the site. Polygonal bastions projected outward at intervals, allowing defenders to watch and respond from multiple angles. It was designed to endure, to resist fire, to resist weather, to resist people who arrived without permission. Inside these walls, Roman life continued in a quieter, more routine way. Supplies arrived by river and sea. Soldiers drilled. Orders were issued and obeyed. The fort became part of a wider defensive network protecting the western edge of Roman Britain, and then gradually Rome withdrew. By the early 5th century, Roman administration collapsed. Soldiers left. Supply lines dried up. Authority dissolved. The great stone walls were abandoned, not destroyed, just forgotten. Over time, earth crept up against them. Grass grew, soil settled. The river changed its course. Generations passed with little understanding of what lay beneath their feet. The Roman fort became a shape in the landscape, a raised enclosure, a useful boundary, a place that felt old even when no one knew why. For centuries the walls slept underground, intact but invisible. They waited through Saxon movements, Welsh kingdoms and Norman ambitions, quietly holding their shape beneath the soil. They would not be seen again until the 19th century, but they never truly went away. They were simply waiting. When the Normans arrived in Wales, they did not start from scratch. They almost never did. Instead, they looked for places that already made sense, places shaped by earlier powers that understood geography the same way they did. Cardiff was one of those places. By the late 11th century, the Roman walls were no longer visible, but the raised enclosure remained. The land still felt defended. It still felt important. To a Norman commander, that was an invitation. In 1081, following William the Conqueror's campaigns in Wales, the site passed into Norman control. Soon after, Robert Fitzamon was granted the lordship of Glamorgan, and with it, responsibility for keeping this corner of Wales firmly under Norman authority. Fitzamon did not question the Roman footprint. He built directly inside it. The first Norman castle at Cardiff was a motte and bailey. A massive artificial earth mound was raised within the old Roman enclosure, towering above the surrounding land. At its summit stood a wooden tower. Below it spread a bailey of timber buildings, workshops and storage spaces. This was a castle built quickly, with purpose. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to dominate. From the top of the motte, Norman lords could see the river, the roads, and the surrounding countryside. They could also be seen, which was the point. Life inside the early Norman castle was crowded and functional. Soldiers trained. Horses were kept ready. Supplies were guarded carefully. The castle existed as a constant reminder that authority now lived here. In the 12th century, the castle passed to Robert of Gloucester, known as Robert the Consul, an illegitimate son of King Henry I. He was powerful, wealthy, and inclined to replace temporary structures with something more convincing. Under his control, the wooden tower atop the motte was replaced with a stone shell keep. 12-sided, thick-walled, and unmistakable, it remains the most recognisable feature of Cardiff Castle today. The keep was both fortress and residence. Inside, rooms were arranged around the inner wall. Fireplaces provided warmth. Windows offered views and limited optimism. The structure projected stability in an unstable land. Cardiff Castle became a place where politics happened quietly and securely. It was important enough to be noticed, but not so comfortable that people lingered longer than necessary. At one point the castle served as a prison for Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, and elder brother to King Henry I. Curthose was held here for 8 years, a reminder that even nobility could find themselves on the wrong side of power. Imprisonment in a castle like Cardiff was not theatrical. It was patient. Stone walls, limited movement, long days, the kind of punishment that worked slowly. Over time, the de Clare family inherited the castle and expanded it further. Curtain walls were strengthened, towers were added. The Black Tower rose along the south side, reinforcing defences and increasing the castle's presence. The castle continued to function as a frontier stronghold. Wales did not settle quietly. Power shifted often. Rebellions flared and subsided. Cardiff Castle stood in the middle of it all, absorbing pressure. In 1404, during the Welsh uprising led by Owain Glyndwr, the castle fell. Glyndwr's forces captured Cardiff and set it on fire. Buildings burned, damage spread. The shell keep survived, but the event marked a turning point. The age of constant medieval warfare was slowly drawing to a close. Castles would not disappear, but their role would change. Cardiff Castle remained standing, scarred but intact. It had been Roman. It had been Norman. It had been contested. It had endured. And it was about to become something else entirely. By the late 15th century, Cardiff Castle no longer sat at the edge of an active war zone. The great surges of medieval conquest had slowed. The uprisings had burned themselves out. Wales, for better or worse, was being folded into a more centralised kingdom. Castles across Britain faced an awkward question. What exactly were they for now? Cardiff Castle still looked imposing. Its Roman walls lingered beneath the earth. Its Norman keep still crowned the motte. Its towers still cast long shadows across the river. But the nature of power had changed. Authority was now exercised through administration, land ownership, and loyalty rather than constant siege. The castle passed into the hands of the Herbert family, one of the most influential dynasties in Wales. Under their ownership, Cardiff began its transition from military stronghold to aristocratic residence. This did not happen all at once. Castles are stubborn things. They resist comfort. Thick walls trap cold. Narrow windows resist light. Drafts move freely, regardless of status. But changes began. Residential quarters were improved. Interiors were softened. Storage rooms became living spaces. The castle was still defensible, but defence was no longer its main purpose. It was now a symbol. When the English Civil War erupted in the 1640s, Cardiff Castle was drawn back into conflict. The war was not fought along clear borders. It unfolded as a series of sudden shifts, allegiances changing almost overnight. Cardiff Castle changed hands more than once. Royalist forces occupied it. Parliamentarians captured it. Control shifted again. Each takeover was tense but relatively restrained. The castle was useful, but it was no longer irreplaceable. Importantly, Cardiff avoided the fate of many other castles at the war's end. When Parliament ordered the deliberate destruction of fortifications to prevent future rebellions, Cardiff Castle was spared. This decision likely saved it. Its walls remained standing. Its keep remained intact. Its layered history stayed visible, even if partially buried beneath later additions. After the war, the castle slipped into a quieter phase. It was no longer central to national conflict. Instead, it became part of an estate, a feature of land ownership rather than military strategy. The medieval heart of the castle survived not because it was constantly maintained, but because it was never fully erased. Stone structures were reused rather than demolished. Old walls became boundaries. Towers became landmarks. By the 18th century, Cardiff Castle existed in a strange state. It was ancient but lived in, defensive but decorative, a medieval shell containing early modern life. It waited, largely unnoticed, for someone wealthy enough and imaginative enough to transform it completely. That person would arrive in the next century, bringing with him coal money, romantic obsession, and a man who believed medieval architecture had simply not been extravagant enough the first time. And Cardiff Castle would change again. By the late 18th century, Cardiff Castle entered the most dramatic phase of its life. Not a siege, not a rebellion, but a renovation project with an extremely large budget and absolutely no interest in restraint. The castle passed into the hands of the Bute family, whose wealth would come not from war or land alone, but from coal. Cardiff was becoming one of the most important ports in the world, and the Bute estate sat directly at the centre of that transformation. Coal-funded imagination, and imagination in this case came with towers. The early changes were subtle. Landscaped grounds replaced cramped medieval courtyards. The interior was opened up. Old walls were removed to create space and symmetry. Capability Brown, the era's most fashionable landscape designer, reshaped the grounds into a sweeping green space. This was not about defence, it was about views. By the mid-19th century, the castle was no longer pretending to be a military structure. It was becoming a statement, a romantic vision of the Middle Ages, rebuilt with Victorian confidence and Victorian money. The third Marquess of Bute inherited the castle in 1848. He was young, wealthy, deeply religious, intensely scholarly, and entirely uninterested in moderation. He did not want a comfortable home. He wanted a medieval dream rebuilt exactly as it should have been, had medieval builders possessed unlimited funding and modern engineering. To achieve this, he hired William Burgess. Burgess was an architect, designer, and visionary who believed history was not something to be preserved quietly. It was something to be improved upon enthusiastically. Together, Bute and Burgess turned Cardiff Castle into one of the most elaborate Gothic revival projects in Europe. The clock tower rose first. Tall, narrow, and unapologetically dramatic. It housed bachelor suites themed around time, astronomy, and philosophy. Each room followed a specific symbolic program. Walls, ceilings, furniture, and even door handles participated in the same visual conversation. Nothing was accidental. The interiors became increasingly ornate. Gold leaf appeared frequently. Murals covered walls. Ceilings told stories. Motifs repeated until they became immersive. The winter smoking room embraced astrology, decorated with the signs of the zodiac. This was not subtle, it was cosmic. Guests were invited to smoke beneath representations of the universe, a reminder that time, fate, and personal habits were all part of a larger order. The Arab room pushed even further. Inspired by Islamic architecture, it featured a breathtaking honeycomb ceiling, known as a muqarnas, covered in gold leaf and jewel tones. It was less a room and more a statement that the Gothic revival had no intention of staying in one cultural lane. This was medieval fantasy filtered through Victorian confidence. While interiors grew richer, the castle's past was also being uncovered. In 1888, Lord Bute ordered excavations that revealed the Roman walls beneath centuries of soil and later construction. Instead of removing them, he restored them. The Roman stonework was rebuilt and marked with a red sandstone line to distinguish original masonry from reconstruction. It was a rare moment of archaeological honesty in an otherwise imaginative project. The castle now openly displayed its layered history: Roman foundations, Norman earthworks, medieval towers, Victorian fantasy layered on top. The animal wall followed soon after, a long boundary wall decorated with 15 stone animals climbing, lounging and observing the city beyond. Lions, bears, lynx, each one detailed and oddly expressive. It was defensive architecture turned playful, a reminder that this phase of the castle was about spectacle, not survival. By the end of the 19th century, Cardiff Castle had been transformed into something entirely unique. Not a preserved ruin, not a modern residence, but a deliberate blend of history, symbolism, and artistic ambition. It was a castle rebuilt not to fight wars, but to impress guests and satisfy a very specific vision of the past. And for a time, it worked perfectly. But the 20th century would arrive with less interest in fantasy and far more interest in survival. The 20th century did not arrive gently at Cardiff Castle. It arrived with timetables, uniforms, and the distant sound of engines moving toward war. For centuries, the castle had been shaped by conflict, then by comfort, then by imagination. Now it was about to be used again, not as a symbol, but as shelter. When the Second World War began, Cardiff was an industrial city and a strategic target. The docks that had once fueled the Bute fortune now placed the city squarely in danger. Air raids became a reality rather than a rumour. The castle's ancient walls, thickened by Roman engineering and medieval reinforcement, offered something modern buildings could not: protection. Engineers hollowed out sections of the curtain wall to create air raid shelters capable of holding nearly 2,000 people. Tunnels were carved into spaces that had once been solid stone. What had begun as fortification against sea raiders and armies now served against aircraft. The experience inside was quiet, tense, and strangely communal. Families gathered beneath arches built centuries earlier. Children sat on benches carved into walls laid by Roman hands. The castle became part of everyday survival. Above ground, the towers remained visible. Below, history held its breath. When the war ended, Cardiff Castle faced another transition. This time, it was not driven by violence or wealth, but by inheritance. In 1947, following the death of the 4th Marquess of Bute, the castle and the surrounding park were gifted to the city of Cardiff. It was an extraordinary act. A private estate shaped over centuries became a public space overnight. The meaning of the castle shifted again. It was no longer a residence, no longer a defensive structure, no longer a private vision. It became a shared inheritance. Preservation replaced transformation. Restoration replaced redesign. Archaeology replaced imagination. Layers of history were studied rather than overwritten. The Roman walls, once buried, were stabilised. The medieval keep was conserved. The Victorian interiors were maintained, not expanded. The castle settled into a new role, a place of memory. Visitors walked the same paths once used by Roman soldiers, Norman lords, Victorian architects, and wartime families. The stones did not explain themselves. They simply remained. And yet the story was not finished, because castles do not exist only in the past. They exist in how they are used, interpreted, and remembered. Cardiff Castle continued to host ceremonies, events, and quiet moments of reflection. It stood as a record of adaptation. From fortress to home, from fantasy to shelter, from private ambition to public trust. What comes next belongs to a different kind of history, one shaped not by rulers or architects, but by those who walk its grounds, stand beneath its towers, and carry its story forward without even realising it. And that story is still unfolding. After becoming the property of the city, Cardiff Castle entered a phase unlike any before it. For the first time in its long existence, it no longer belonged to a single ruler, family or institution. It belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to no one in particular. This changed how the castle was treated. Decisions slowed down. Every stone mattered. Every alteration required justification. Where once ambition drove construction, now caution guided preservation. The castle became a place people visited rather than occupied. Its rooms, once private and purposeful, were now carefully interpreted. Guides learned to tell stories that stretched across centuries without favouring one era too heavily. Roman stones were given equal weight to Victorian fantasy. Norman earthworks were allowed to sit quietly beside Gothic ornament. Nothing needed to prove itself anymore. The city grew around the castle in ways no medieval builder could have imagined. Traffic flowed past its walls. Office buildings rose nearby. Shops, cafes and schools surrounded ground once shaped by legions and knights. Yet the castle remained oddly separate. Inside the walls, time moved differently. Sounds softened. Stone absorbed the noise of the city. Visitors slowed their pace without realising why. The castle did not demand attention. It simply waited. During the late 20th century, restoration efforts became more precise. Archaeologists re-examined earlier assumptions. Victorian reconstructions were studied carefully rather than removed. The red sandstone lines marking Roman repairs became teaching tools rather than decorations. The castle began to explain itself, slowly and without urgency. New uses emerged. Concerts were held on the grounds. Public events filled the green spaces once cleared by Capability Brown. Fireworks illuminated towers originally designed to intimidate enemies who no longer existed. The castle adapted without resistance. Museums opened within its walls. Stories once told only in academic journals became accessible to visitors passing through on a quiet afternoon. Roman soldiers, Norman lords, imprisoned dukes, coal barons and wartime families all shared space in the same narrative. No single story dominated. Children visited on school trips. Some listened carefully. Others focused on the animal wall, counting stone lions and bears with serious concentration. Both experiences were valid. The castle had learned patience. Even now the stone continues to age. Weather softens edges. Mortar requires replacement. Preservation is never complete. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present. The castle does not resist this. It has already survived abandonment, fire, reinvention and war. It understands that permanence is an illusion built from careful maintenance and collective attention. Cardiff Castle stands today not as a finished monument, but as a process. A structure still being interpreted, still being cared for, still being used in ways its builders never planned. What it becomes next will depend on choices not yet made, on people not yet born, on stories not yet told. For now, the walls remain. The towers cast familiar shadows. The city moves around them, and the castle waits, as it always has, quietly ready for whatever history decides to bring next. Before Caerphilly Castle rose from the ground, there was very little here to admire in the usual sense. The land was low, marshy, and often wet. Streams spread out and slowed down, forming pools and bogs that resisted both feet and wheels. It was the sort of place that discouraged quick movement and rewarded patience, whether you were a farmer, a traveller, or someone thinking about building a very large stone fortress for political reasons. In the 12th and 13th centuries, this part of South Wales sat near a border that never quite settled down. The line between Welsh-controlled territory and lands claimed by the English crown shifted slowly, often without clear agreement, and sometimes without anyone noticing until a castle appeared, where there had previously been grass and water. Borders in medieval Wales were not neat lines on maps. They were lived in spaces, full of negotiation, tension, and the occasional reminder that someone nearby disagreed with you strongly enough to bring soldiers. This region lay within what was known as the Welsh Marches. The word march did not mean walking quickly, it meant borderland, and borderlands, especially medieval ones, had a habit of producing men with titles, armies, and a strong belief in their own authority. These men were the Marcher Lords. They ruled their territories with unusual independence, holding lands in the name of the English crown, but often acting as if the distance from London gave them permission to make their own rules. They could raise armies, build castles, and enforce laws locally, which made them powerful and occasionally inconvenient neighbours. One of these men was Gilbert de Clare, a member of a family whose wealth and influence stretched across England and Wales. Gilbert inherited not just land, but responsibility for holding it, which in this context meant defending it against Welsh princes who had long-standing claims of their own. Ownership here was rarely a quiet affair. Across the border, Welsh rulers continued to assert control over their ancestral lands. By the mid-13th century, the most powerful among them was Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, often called Llywelyn the Last. He did not think of himself as the last at the time. That label was added later by historians who enjoy tidiness more than history usually allows. Llywelyn sought to consolidate Welsh territories and resist further encroachment by Norman lords and the English crown. From his perspective, castles rising in places like Caerphilly were not neutral buildings. They were statements, large stone statements delivered without conversation. The basin where Caerphilly would be built was strategically useful despite, or perhaps because of, its marshy nature. The wetlands slowed movement and limited approach routes. With enough labour, water could be redirected, controlled, and turned into a defensive system. It was not an obvious place to build a castle, which is often a sign that someone had thought about it very carefully. When Gilbert de Clare decided to fortify this area, he was not responding to a single event or battle. He was reacting to a pattern: raids, counter-raids, shifting allegiances and treaties that worked briefly before being tested again. Castles in this landscape were less about dramatic sieges and more about endurance. They were built to last longer than arguments. There may already have been earlier earthworks or timber defences nearby, though evidence for them is limited and uncertain. If they existed, they were temporary things, the sort of structures meant to hold a place for a season, not a century. Stone, however, suggested permanence, even if permanence was something medieval politics rarely honoured. It is worth noting that Caerphilly was never intended to be a quiet residence. This was not a romantic retreat or a picturesque stronghold chosen for views. It was a working fortress, placed deliberately in contested land, meant to control movement, project authority, and quietly remind everyone nearby who currently held the advantage. Legends, which must be clearly labelled as legends, later claimed that this area had long been a gathering place for ancient rituals or assemblies. Such stories are common around large monuments and defensive sites. They are interesting, atmospheric, and impossible to prove. No reliable evidence connects Caerphilly's location to pre-Christian ritual centres, though the landscape itself likely held meaning long before stone walls appeared. As with many legends, they tell us more about later imagination than earlier fact. By the late 1260s, tensions in South Wales were sharpening rather than easing. Negotiations had limits, borders remained unclear, and patience on all sides was wearing thin. It was into this unsettled landscape of water, authority, and unfinished disputes that Caerphilly Castle would soon be placed. Not as a solution exactly, more as a very large, very expensive pause in the ongoing argument, and with that decision made, the ground itself would have to be persuaded to cooperate. Construction at Caerphilly began in 1268, once Gilbert de Clare had secured permission that was just official enough to proceed. The timing was deliberate, political pressure was increasing, and stone has a way of clarifying intentions. The first challenge was not enemies, it was water. The land chosen for the castle sat in a shallow basin where streams slowed, spread and pooled. Rather than fighting this, the builders decided to organise it. Channels were dug, embankments were raised, water was redirected until it formed a system of artificial lakes surrounding the planned fortress. This was not decoration, it was the primary defence. If you were approaching Caerphilly, you would first meet water. Wide, slow water that offered no firm footing and very little shelter. It was deep enough to discourage wading and broad enough to make swimming an unattractive career choice. Before a single wall was finished, the landscape itself had already become an obstacle. Only then did the stonework begin. Caerphilly was designed as a concentric castle, meaning it had multiple lines of defence arranged one inside the other. Put simply, there was an outer ring, an inner ring, and no expectation that attackers would enjoy the journey between them. Each wall was positioned so defenders could watch, respond, and wait. This was not a castle built for sudden heroics. It was built for patience. The scale of the project was considerable. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, and hauled across difficult ground. Timber was needed for scaffolding, hoardings, and temporary structures. Food had to be supplied for hundreds of labourers over long periods. Nothing about this was quick. The marshy soil created additional complications. Foundations had to be carefully laid, often reinforced with layers of compacted material to prevent settling. Despite these precautions, the ground would never be entirely cooperative. The land accepted the castle, but not without conditions. The inner ward took shape first, surrounded by massive curtain walls and flanked by large round towers. These towers were not decorative. Their curved shape helped deflect missiles and eliminated weak corners. They also made interior spaces darker, cooler, and quietly echoing, which was useful for defence and less useful for comfort. Beyond this stood the outer ward, enclosed by its own walls and towers, and separated from the inner castle by water and carefully controlled access points. Bridges connected these spaces, all of them designed to be removed, blocked, or made inconvenient at short notice. It is worth pausing to appreciate the confidence involved in this design. Caerphilly was not modest. It was among the largest castles built in Britain, and certainly the most ambitious in Wales. Building something this large in a wet basin was a statement that Gilbert de Clare intended to stay. Work progressed steadily, but not peacefully. The castle rose during a period of tension with Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, and the unfinished walls were already enough to provoke concern. Even incomplete, Caerphilly altered the balance of power in the region. Stone does that. Modern comparisons are tempting here. This was less like building a house and more like constructing a fortified industrial site in the middle of disputed territory, while everyone nearby watched closely and took notes. It required funding, organisation, and the ability to continue working even when circumstances became uncomfortable. By the early 1270s, much of the core structure was in place. The water defences were functioning. The walls stood high enough to matter. Caerphilly was not finished, but it was already effective. It would soon be tested. Not by ceremony or celebration, but by the simple fact that unfinished castles are invitations. By the time Caerphilly Castle had reached a functional, if unfinished, state, the wider political situation in Wales was becoming increasingly strained. This was not a sudden shift. It was the slow tightening of conditions that had been developing for years, made more visible by the appearance of large stone walls in places that had previously been open ground. For Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the continued expansion of Norman fortifications into Welsh territory was a clear threat. Castles like Caerphilly were not merely defensive structures. They were tools of administration, supply and control. Once built, they tended to stay, and so did the authority they represented. In 1270, while construction was still underway, Caerphilly was attacked by forces loyal to Llywelyn. The assault was not a dramatic storming of towers or a cinematic clash at the gates. Instead, it followed the practical logic of medieval conflict. An unfinished castle was vulnerable. Timber scaffolding could burn. Supplies could be seized. Workers could be driven away. The attackers managed to damage parts of the site and disrupt building efforts. For a time, Caerphilly fell into Welsh hands. This was less a capture in the modern sense and more a successful interruption. The castle existed, but it could not yet fully defend itself. Gilbert de Clare responded not with haste, but with persistence. Construction resumed when circumstances allowed, and the castle's defences were strengthened as work continued. The goal was not immediate retaliation, it was permanence. These events unfolded against the backdrop of broader conflict between Llywelyn and Edward I of England, whose interest in Wales was systematic rather than impulsive. Edward's campaigns in the late 1270s and early 1280s aimed to bring Wales under firmer royal control. In this context, Caerphilly became part of a much larger strategy, whether its builders liked it or not. When Edward's forces moved decisively against Llywelyn, the balance of power shifted. Llywelyn was killed in 1282 and organised Welsh resistance weakened soon after. This did not mean that peace arrived suddenly or quietly. It meant that castles like Caerphilly no longer faced the same level of coordinated opposition. Once the immediate threat had passed, work at Caerphilly accelerated. The interruptions of the early 1270s were absorbed into the structure itself. Stone replaced timber, walls grew thicker, defensive systems became more refined. It is tempting to describe this period as a triumph for one side or a failure for the other. That is not how it felt at the time. For those living nearby, it was a continuation of life under shifting authority, marked by new obligations and familiar uncertainties. Castles did not end disputes, they simply made them heavier. Legends sometimes suggest that Caerphilly was captured through clever tricks or secret tunnels during this period. These stories are later inventions, common to many castles. There is no reliable evidence for hidden passages playing a decisive role here. The reality was slower, less imaginative, and far more typical of medieval warfare. By the time the final stones were set into place, Caerphilly had already proven its value. It had survived attack, occupation, and political change. It had done so not by dramatic defence, but by being difficult to remove. With external threats reduced, the castle could finally settle into its intended role, not as a battlefield, but as a place of administration, storage, and long stretches of waiting. Once Caerphilly Castle was complete and the major conflicts of its early years had passed, it entered the phase that would define most of its existence. Not warfare, but routine. The castle was garrisoned by a modest number of soldiers, not an army, enough men to guard gates, patrol walls, and make the castle feel occupied rather than abandoned. Their days followed predictable patterns, watches, inspections, and long periods of standing still while looking at water. Guard duty at Caerphilly involved a great deal of watching surfaces that did not change. The lakes reflected the sky. The marshes remained marshy. If someone approached, they would be visible well in advance, assuming they had not already reconsidered their decision. Inside the walls, daily life revolved around maintenance and supply. Castles consumed resources even when nothing happened. Food had to be stored, tools repaired, timber replaced, stone checked for cracks caused by damp ground that never quite stopped moving. The inner ward housed essential buildings, halls, kitchens, storage rooms, and quarters for the constable and his household. These spaces were functional rather than comfortable. Fireplaces provided heat, though unevenly. Light entered through narrow openings designed more for defence than cheerfulness. Smoke tended to linger. Meals were simple and repetitive. Grain formed the backbone of the diet, supplemented by salted meat, cheese, and whatever could be obtained locally. Fresh food was welcome when available, but reliability mattered more than variety. Nothing about castle life encouraged culinary experimentation. Water, so carefully managed outside, was equally important within. Wells and cisterns ensured supply, while drainage systems attempted to keep dampness under control. They did not always succeed. Moisture was a constant companion at Caerphilly, seeping into stone and wood alike. The outer ward functioned as a buffer zone. It held additional storage, stables, and work areas. During periods of tension, it could shelter people and livestock from the surrounding countryside. During quiet times it simply existed, waiting for a reason to matter. Administration was another daily concern. The castle served as a local centre of authority, where rents were collected, disputes heard and instructions issued. These tasks were handled by clerks and officials whose work rarely appears in dramatic accounts, despite being the reason castles remained occupied long after wars ended. For the people who lived and worked here, Caerphilly was not a symbol, it was a place. A damp, echoing place with thick walls and a view of water in nearly every direction. Legend sometimes imagined secret lives within castle walls, hidden romances, conspiracies whispered in corridors, or restless ghosts pacing battlements. While such stories add atmosphere, they are not supported by evidence. What we know suggests something quieter, a community focused on order, repetition, and avoiding unnecessary trouble. Modern comparisons are useful here. Caerphilly in peacetime functioned much like a large administrative complex combined with a warehouse and a security installation. Most days were uneventful. That was the point. Over time, as political priorities shifted and borders stabilised, the castle's strategic importance slowly diminished. It continued to operate, but with less urgency. Repairs became occasional rather than constant. Garrisons shrank. Caerphilly had been built to project authority and endure conflict. Now it did what it would do for centuries more. It stood. No castle is abandoned all at once. The process is gradual, marked by fewer repairs, smaller garrisons, and long stretches where nothing is improved because nothing urgently needs to be. Caerphilly Castle followed this familiar pattern. After the death of Gilbert de Clare in 1295, ownership passed through inheritance, along with the responsibilities that came with it. These responsibilities were increasingly administrative rather than military. Wales was now under firmer English control, and the border tensions that had justified Caerphilly's enormous scale were no longer as immediate. The castle remained in use through the 14th century, but its role changed. It functioned as a local centre of governance and storage, rather than a frontline stronghold. Walls were still maintained, but not improved. Defences existed, but they were rarely tested. The most serious damage to Caerphilly came not from its original enemies, but from later unrest. During the early 15th century, Owain Glyndwr's rebellion swept across much of Wales. Caerphilly was attacked and partially damaged during this period, particularly its southeastern tower, which suffered structural harm. This damage was not fully repaired. There was little incentive to restore the castle to its former strength. By this point, Caerphilly was expensive to maintain and increasingly unnecessary. Political authority could be exercised from more comfortable locations. Over time, neglect did what warfare had not. Roofs decayed, timber rotted, stonework shifted as the soft ground beneath continued its slow, persistent movement. The castle did not collapse dramatically, it simply settled. The most noticeable result of this process is the famous Leaning Tower. One of the southeastern towers gradually tilted as its foundation shifted unevenly. This was not the result of sabotage or deliberate destruction. It was physics, working patiently over centuries. Legends offer more entertaining explanations. Some claim the tower was damaged by cannon fire. Others suggest it was deliberately undermined. These stories are appealing and confidently repeated, but unsupported by evidence. The simpler explanation remains the most reliable. Waterlogged ground and heavy stone do not always agree. By the 16th century, Caerphilly was largely abandoned as a functioning castle. Its buildings were used sporadically, often as sources of stone rather than shelter. Local residents took what they needed. This was practical rather than destructive. The castle had become a convenient quarry. The surrounding lakes gradually silted up, reducing the effectiveness of the water defences and changing the landscape once again. What had once been carefully engineered barriers slowly returned to marshland, as if the site were quietly reverting to its original state. Caerphilly's decline was not a tragedy. It was the natural result of changing priorities. Castles belong to specific political moments. When those moments pass, stone remains, but purpose does not. By the time attention returned to Caerphilly in a more deliberate way, it was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin, stable, impressive, and leaning slightly, but in no hurry to go anywhere. By the time Caerphilly Castle reached the modern era, its days as a working fortress were long over. What remained was stone, water, and an impressive amount of quiet. Interest in the castle revived gradually, not because it was useful, but because it was still there. In the 18th and 19th centuries, ruins began to attract a different kind of attention. They were no longer seen only as failed buildings, but as remnants of an earlier world. Caerphilly fit this new way of thinking very well. Restoration efforts began in earnest during the late 19th century, most notably under the stewardship of the Marquis of Bute. The approach taken was cautious. The goal was not to rebuild Caerphilly as it once had been, but to stabilise it. Walls were secured, collapsed areas were reinforced. The leaning tower was left leaning. This choice mattered. By preserving the castle's imperfections, those responsible acknowledged its history rather than smoothing it away. The tilt of the tower became a feature rather than a problem, a visible reminder of the ground beneath and the centuries above. Archaeological work clarified how the castle had functioned, confirming what its design already suggested. Caerphilly had been built with intention and patience. Its water defences were not decorative additions, but core elements of its strategy. Even in ruin, the system remained legible. In the 20th century, Caerphilly came under state care, ensuring its preservation for future generations. The surrounding landscape was managed to reflect its medieval appearance more closely, with water once again playing a prominent role. Visitors could walk where guards once stood, though now the only requirement was comfortable footwear. Today, Caerphilly Castle is not a place of conflict. It is a place of slow movement. People wander along the walls, pause at the lakes, and look out over the basin without urgency. Birds occupy towers once meant for watchmen. The water continues its quiet work. Legends still circulate, as they do at most old sites. Stories of hidden passages, curses, or ghosts appear from time to time. They are part of the atmosphere, but not the history. The real story of Caerphilly is more restrained and more durable. What makes the castle compelling now is not what happened there, but how long it has been allowed to remain. Stone layered upon stone, water guided, then released. A structure built to dominate a landscape, now content to be part of it. As you leave Caerphilly, or simply imagine doing so, the impression it leaves is not one of violence or urgency. It is one of persistence. A reminder that some arguments end not with victory but with time, and that sometimes the quietest outcome is the one that lasts.